Nothing but war prepares you for war itself. My name is Diane Carlson Evans, and I'm grateful for this interview. I am always happy to talk about my brother and sister veterans whom I served with honorably during the Vietnam era. The Vietnam War became increasingly unpopular because the American public were seeing, for the very first time ever in the history of the United States, they were seeing the war on television. They were seeing it upfront and personal. They were seeing the 6 o'clock news, let's say, with men on the battlefield in body bags. They were seeing napalm and white phosphorus being dropped out of airplanes. And all war movies, you know, you see the planes dropping bombs, of course. But now Vietnam, because the correspondents, the photojournalists, and because of television, they were filming villages being bombed and children and civilian women, Vietnamese civilians of all ages who were innocent, but their villages were being bombed with the thought that those villages were empty. It was not intentional for our pilots and the strategy to just bomb innocent people, but it was what they called later maybe collateral damage. It's what happens in wartime. But the people back home are now seeing this on television, and they're beginning to believe that the war in Vietnam is wrong and that we shouldn't be there, and they want the troops to come home. And a lot of the men who are being drafted are saying, hell no, we won't go. And some of them are going to Canada to avoid the draft. But in keeping with that thought, what I want to explain for me personally is that as nurses, we knew that we were going to save lives. And I didn't know if the war was right or wrong. I hadn't studied enough about Vietnam to really even know, except that it's across the Pacific Ocean and that it was near China. But I knew very little about the war, whether it was right, whether it was wrong, whether to believe the president and the administration. All I knew was that I wanted to be a nurse and that my job would be to save lives. My mother was a nurse. She was the single most influential person in my life. And I talk a lot about her when I wrote my story, In Healing Wounds, the book, because she influenced me every day, even though she was raising us 6 kids on a farm. She went to work at the hospital, and she told me, Diane, she said, I love my work. And I said, well, why can't you just stay home with us? And of course, when you're a child, you want your mom to stay home with you and not go to work. And Mom said, but I love my work. And of course, when she was home, we were her sole attention. She was a wonderful nurse. She was a wonderful mother. So I had a tremendous influence in just seeing all the good that she did for our community and for that small hospital in Minnesota. So I was drawn to nursing, and then I was drawn to Vietnam because of that 6 o'clock news that I just spoke about, in that people are seeing what's happening to our soldiers, and they're also seeing soldiers on stretchers, on gurneys, being taken by helicopter. So now what I'm seeing, the images that I'm seeing on television are helicopters. It was our first helicopter war because we had them. And helicopters were being used for air ambulances. And you would see the medevac, we call them dust-off. Dust-off was, when I called helicopters dust-off helicopters, people say, well, what is that? What's a dust-off? And of course, to me, it was just like part of our language. It was a code dust off, dust off, dust off needed. It was a medical air ambulance. It was a Huey, and those pilots were amazing. They were young like us, even younger, and they would fly into the worst possible conditions and being shot at even, and in terrible weather, monsoons and wind and mountainous regions and jungle and rice paddies and all the kind of terrain that you can think of, the topography and the difference between the southern part of Vietnam near the Mekong and the Delta compared to the jungle the further north you got. The war changed in temperature and terrain, and these pilots were fearless. I'm sure they were afraid. I can't say they were fearless, but they had to have extreme fear, but it didn't matter to them. If a dust-off was needed to get out the wounded, they went in and they sacrificed their own lives by the thousands to save the wounded. And so us nurses, with these dust-off pilots, we were the team. They brought them to us, and the doctors and those incredible medics and corpsmen. Corpsman and medic is an interchangeable word. I called them my medics, I called them my corpsmen. And we were the team. And at the end of the day, we were all they had. I came from Minnesota, from a farm family. My mother was a nurse, and my father was a dairy farmer. There were 6 of us on the farm, and on a dairy farm, it's all about hard work. And my 2 older brothers, then me, then 2 younger brothers and sister, all had our jobs to do on the farm, and there was a serious work ethic. So in the 60s, when my 2 older brothers had to go into the Army, it was hard on my dad because he lost his helpers, but he was very proud to have his sons serving in the military because, of course, he came from the World War II generation, and it was honorable to serve your country. However, our nation at the time was not supporting the war, so there were protests, and my dad was concerned about how the nation was really feeling about the farm boys around us who were getting drafted. When I, as a student nurse in Minneapolis, decided that if my brothers and all my neighboring farm boys have to go to Vietnam and they're being wounded and dying, they must need nurses. I mean, every war has always needed nurses. So I found a nurse recruiter downtown Minneapolis, and I walked in and I asked some questions, and I said to this Army nurse who was in uniform, I said, I'm in nursing school, I graduate in 1967, and I want to go to Vietnam. And they must be taking nurses. And she said, yes, we are in dire need of nurses. There is a shortage in the Army Nurse Corps. And she said, what year are you? And I said, I'm a junior. And she said, well, the good news is there's a program where the government will pay for your tuition, your books, your uniforms, and give you a stipend if you sign on the dotted line to join the Army Nurse Corps. So I signed on the dotted line. And because I just knew, did not hesitate for a moment. I was going to be an Army nurse, and I wanted to go to Vietnam and take care of those young men, those young boys like my brothers. So I had decided that with my brothers both now in the Army, and I had visited my oldest brother at Fort Lee, Virginia, so I had a little closeness to the Army and felt that as an Army nurse, perhaps I'd be in the field and I'd be taking care of those young men who were also serving, who were drafted. But I felt like I never really thought about the Navy or the Air Force. I just wanted to be an Army nurse. My aunt had served in the Army during World War II. I was very proud of her. And after she got out of, when the war ended, she used the GI Bill and she went on to get her doctorate degree and became a college professor. So I had just decided that the Army Nurse Corps was for me. And so I signed on the dotted line, the necessary thing to do for me as a student nurse to promise the Army that I would serve 2 years if I signed up as a junior in college and they would pay my tuition and my books and my uniforms and a stipend. And I didn't dream that was even available, but it was great to have some help to finish my schooling because I was working jobs to help pay to get me through school. But now I have to go home and tell my parents what I have done because I hadn't mentioned this to them at all. I had not talked to them about the fact that I was even thinking about going into the Army. So the next weekend, I waited till my dad had finished milking his 40 cows. And the night that my mom was home, she was a nurse and worked at the hospital on the 3 to 11 shift. And on the evening that she was not working and Dad was up from the barn, they were in the kitchen and we sat down and I just said, Mom and Dad, I want you to know that I signed up for the Army Nurse Corps and they couldn't promise me, but they said it's very likely that if I want to go to Vietnam and I volunteer that I will go. After I graduate from nursing school and pass my state boards and go to basic training, which would be 6 weeks at Brooke Army Medical Center. The kitchen got very quiet. And my dad, who was a stoic Scandinavian Swede, who was not very talkative, didn't say a word, but he slammed his fist on the kitchen table and walked out the door. That was his response to what I had just done. He was not happy at all. My mother, who was a registered nurse, was quiet, but I think she understood. So I've had my 9 months of working at Fort Lee, Virginia, Kenner Army Hospital, before I left for Vietnam. It was interesting because when I volunteered to go to Vietnam right out of basic training, the officer said, well, it might be a good idea for you to get a little experience before you go off to war. And I thought, well, I can't agree more with that, you know, to go off to war when you're 21, almost 22, without having had a lot of experience. So it was good experience. My soldiers, my patients at Brooke Army Medical Center, it was an orthopedic unit, and there were about 40 returning GIs. GI stands for government issue. It's an old term, and government issue is our draftees, of course, but these young patients, all of them had been wounded in Vietnam and had orthopedic injuries. And they were young, and I was young, and it was an interesting 9 months because these guys, they knew that I wanted to go to Vietnam, so they pulled some tricks on me that were pretty funny. And but some of the experiences I had in that unit weren't funny because I didn't understand what soldiers were like when they came home from war. I'll give an example. One night, I'm on night shift, and I'm passing out medications and starting IVs and doing all the things nurses do. But I hadn't learned that you never startle a returning soldier. So he was sound asleep, and time for his meds, and I went up to him and I got close to his face and I shook his shoulder and he wouldn't wake up. I shook it really hard, and all of a sudden he woke up and he tried to put his hands around my neck, and he just like almost came out of his traction. Now, this is an orthopedic unit. They're in traction. Their legs, their arms are in traction. And he swore at me, and he said something, and don't you ever do that again. I could have killed you. And I was like, it was his startled response. It was like he thought I was the enemy. Like, he was terrified. And so then I learned that you go up to their feet, you at the end of the bed, and you wiggle their. I said, well, next time I'm just going to wiggle your foot to wake you up. And he said, well, that's fine. That's fine. And then another night, I dropped a bedpan. Now, a metal bedpan on a tile floor makes a whole lot of noise, and it woke up. Every guy in that unit woke up and started swearing at me. And so I wasn't making a very good impression my first couple of weeks with those guys. But they taught me. They taught me a lot. My orders came, and I was to leave July 30th, 1968. And I flew home to say goodbye to my parents on my way to Vietnam. And it was a hot summer, sultry Minnesota humid day, and it did look like it might start raining, and my dad had to get in the alfalfa. That's what farmers do. They look at the weather, and everything depends on the weather, what their plans are. So he was not taking me to the airport. My sister and my mother were taking me, but I went down to the barn to say goodbye, and Dad came out in his Sears Roebuck overalls, and that he was always in. And I said, well, Dad, I'm just going to say goodbye. And my dad was not very demonstrative with affection, but he hugged me, and he had tears rolling down his eyes, and he said, I have 4 sons, and I send my daughter off to war. And I never forgot those words, because when you're 21, which is what I was, you don't think about being a parent. You don't think about what is it like to send a son or daughter off to war. You just think you're sort of bulletproof, and you're just thinking about yourself. You're not thinking about what your parents think about it so much. And then after I had 3 sons of my own, years later, and a daughter, I thought about, what would that be like if I had to send one of my children off to war? So it took me a while to understand how he felt. And of course, fathers didn't think very much about sending their daughters off to war. The stereotype, if you will, is that only men go off to war. But that's not true. Women have been serving our nation since the birth of this nation. They may not have been eligible for the military itself, but they served in other ways, and always as nurses. There were always women at the time who stepped up to take care of wounded soldiers. And of course, now we have men in the Army Nurse Corps. So when we talk about Army nurses, we include, of course, it's men and women serving in the Army Nurse Corps. So then now I'm off to Oakland Air Base in California to get on that airplane. And I'm in a terminal. My world is now men. I am surrounded by hundreds, soon to be thousands, of men, and soon to be my patients. And on that airplane, there was one nurse sitting with me and 2 other nurses in a different place on the plane. So it was about 247 soldiers on their way to Vietnam, and I'm sure they were all terrified. And when we arrived in Vietnam, it was late at night, and the plane came down, and it was a very rough landing because the tarmac was like a metal tarmac, and there were big holes in it from it had been rocketed and mortared, and it was kind of dark, but when we landed, the pilot said, women nurses out first. And so we went to the door, and the door opened, and there was just this blast. It's now August 1st, and there was this blast of heat and a stench, a smell that kind of smelled like the barn. I grew up on a farm, so I was used to smells that weren't, you know, the smell of stench. And that's what it smelled like. And jet fuel, and then the sounds. And but what struck me instantly was the reality that now I'm in a war zone, because the soldier who met us at the door had a bandolier of ammunition and his weapon was ready. And he said, ladies, we were called ladies. That was the last time I was ever called a lady in Vietnam. Ladies, keep your heads down and get to the bus. So we got off to this bus that was waiting for all of us, and we got in the bus, and the windows were painted black and had chicken wire to prevent any kind of shrapnel or anything if we had been, attacked. So that was a reality check. It's like, okay, now we're in the war zone. So we get to our billets where we're going to spend the night. 2 days there, getting our uniforms, getting fit for boots. They didn't have combat boots my size. Are you surprised? They issued us men's underwear. They were issuing us wool long johns that had been used in Korea. And as us nurses were going through the packets from supply of all the stuff that we were to wear in Vietnam, we started laughing. What else could we do? Like, this stuff says Korea on it. And I sent it all home to my brothers in Minnesota, and they wore it in the winter. But then we finally got issued our jungle fatigues and boots that fit, and now I'm off to my first assignment.